every year.
There's a total disconnect now between the ruling group and the masses.
I hate psychology.
Clear out.
They're the same worm-like characters.
Analysts.
Fuck you with your stupid arguments.
They should not bother us.
Democracy. All of this just works.
Vote for the generations of a coming.
Fully dynamic game engine.
A millennial video essayist.
Always support strength,
Constant craving.
and identity.
I haven't yearned. They are a disease of our time.
Clear them out. You're voting for what your grandfather and father fought for.
I sit and yearn.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of The Longhouse, the weekly show for the sensible centrists. So, to anyone who is listening this week, I'll just let you know right away, I've had some technical difficulties with my computer that broke down yesterday before I was going to set up everything for the show. So I had to put together a bit of a temporary platform to stream from, which means that the audio might not be the same as you're used to, but I think I've managed to replicate it as well as possible. As you can see as well, this week we're also not joined by Ludwig Path. He is still enjoying his vacation, but he will probably be back maybe in a week, maybe in two. We'll see how it goes. Instead, I am joined tonight by J Otto Pohl. That's Jonathan Otto Pohl, PhD and PhD of History, if I'm correct, and author of The Years of Great Silence, among other books. The Years of Great Silence, subtitled The Deportation, Special Settlement and Mobilization into the Labor Army of Ethnic Germans in the USSR, 1941 to 1955. Welcome.
Thank you.
All right, so before we get into the book, I want to talk a little bit about you and about your work. I see you've spent, I stumbled on your CV, I think you posted it on Twitter actually, and you've spent a lot of time in a lot of different universities in Iraq, is that correct? In Ghana, in Kyrgyzstan, is that true?
I taught overseas as a university lecturer for 12 years. The last 3 were in Iraqi Kurdistan. But before that, I was in Ghana, at the University of Ghana, Legon, for almost 6 years. And before that, I was in Kyrgyzstan teaching at the American University of Central Asia in Bishkek for 3 years. So from 2007 to 2019, I taught in Kyrgyzstan, then Ghana, and then Iraqi Kurdistan.
And I see you've sort of, if we can call it specializing, a lot of your work seems to focus on the USSR. I assume that's some of the stuff you taught about as well at these universities?
I did teach some Soviet history. I taught a lot of world history, conflict between 1914 and 1945, as well as the Cold War after 1945. Taught some more thematic classes on ethnicity, race, and nationalism. Also required to teach something kind of outside my training in things like geography and international relations. But most of my career, as I said, the biggest chunk of it, I was at the University of Ghana. And there I taught mostly European and world history, since there wasn't a huge demand specifically for Soviet history. But I did teach the graduate classes in history on the history of ethnicity, race, and nation.
Right. And in your writings, I mean, that I guess is where I just scrolled through it, and it's a lot of Soviets. I don't mean that in a derogatory way. It seems that you've sort of specialized in a certain period of Soviet history. Can you tell me a bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I started getting interested in it the 80s, particularly had neighbors who were second generation Lithuanians who were quite involved in emigre politics. And my own background are ethnic Germans from Poland and Ukraine, when Poland, the eastern part, was under Tsarist Russian rule. So I had kind of a going into it. But when the Soviet Union declassified a lot of the archives in the early 90s, I found one of the most interesting things, more interesting than the Gulag itself, which is one of my earlier areas of interest, was the Soviet deportation of whole nationalities, of which the largest were ethnic Germans, primarily in the Volga and Black Sea region, Ukraine and Crimea. And so I kind of went with that and started doing some stuff on some other nationalities. I have some stuff on Crimean Tatars, stuff on ethnic Koreans from the Russian Far East deported into Central Asia. And when I did my graduate work, I did it at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. And my specialty there was Central Asia, which is the area where most of these people were deported into. About half of the Germans were deported into northern Kazakhstan, and the other half mostly into western Siberia, although about 75,000 were sent to Krasnoyarsk Krai in eastern Siberia.
Right, and we'll get a bit more into that as we get into the topic of your book. So, something that I saw you posted on Twitter is that you've been blacklisted. Is that correct for some journals that you have written?
I assume so. I can't think of any other reason why I would have over 3,000 applications and less than 6 interviews in the last 20 years in the United States.
That's quite substantial. Would you know if there's anything in particular that sort of, caught the ire of
The
eye of Sauron, as it were?
My second book came out in 1999, and this was before I went to London. Ethnic Cleansing in the USSR in 1937 to 1949. And in the preface or introduction, I criticized Deborah Lipstadt for denying an ethnic component to Soviet repression. Her claim that all of Stalin's terror was completely arbitrary and that, quote, no citizen of the Soviet Union assumed that deportation or death were inevitable consequences of his or her ethnic origin. And Michael Gilb at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum wrote some very negative reviews of that book and my previous book in 97, which doesn't mention anything related to Lipstadt or that era. But I'm pretty sure he was the one who got me blacklisted back then in 99. But since I didn't have a PhD and wasn't applying to any jobs, I don't think it really mattered. But after I got my PhD at London, I was living on my uncle's ranch in Arizona, and I published an article that was a revision of a paper I gave in Beirut in Lebanon while I was still doing my PhD, and it was on the Soviet influence on early Israel, particularly the Israelis copying the Soviet deportation of Volga German and Crimean Tatars in the way they treated the Palestinians in 1947, really all the way to 1966, but particularly 47 to 49. And that was published in Human Rights Review. And the editor at that time was at Tulane University in Louisiana, I believe. But I'm pretty sure that anything that had already gotten me in trouble criticizing Lipstadt just doubled down for the people like Michael Gilb at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum to make sure there's nobody out there criticizing the Orthodox narrative that there was no persecution of non-Jews by their race in the Soviet Union ever. That Jews are the only people that ever suffered racial discrimination in the USSR. That there was no genocide against ethnic Germans or persecution of ethnic Germans ever in the Soviet Union. It's kind of a line. They can't defend it in academic writing, but they push it in public, and they make sure that no academics doing that type of research get jobs at University of the United States. Or
Yeah,
Canada.
you can certainly
It
feel
spreads into the northern country.
right. Yeah, you can certainly feel that this part of history is, well, suppressed might not be the correct word, but it's certainly glossed over in favor of a lot more popular narratives when you learn about World War II in mainstream schooling, right? And I think it's important to very often people in what we call our spheres who are adjacent to this channel and on Twitter use the word boomer truth regime to sort of describe the mythos of post-war, the post-war West, and sort of the underlying truths that we have built our civilization upon, in a sense, and realizing that, you know, there were ethnic atrocities being committed on both sides is an important part of understanding that actually history isn't as simple as it has seemed for the past 70 or so years. So I can understand why that, along with specific criticisms towards specific people, as you said, can land you in some hot water. And that is unfortunate, because I think we shouldn't be afraid of history, right? But of course, not everyone sees it that way, and a lot of people use it as a weapon. So, so if we're going to really just dig into it, then I'm going to bring up the book for anyone interested. I'll bring up the EU. Let's see here. This is not the right tab. I'm sorry. One moment. I open this.
Did you have difficulty getting delivered since Norway isn't an EU country?
Yes, I did. So I ended up getting like the ebook version of this. So this is available through this website here in EU. The delivery might be a bit rough, as you said, but it is available in ebook form. I think it's also available on Amazon if you use that for ebooks or just books in general. And I've also left the link to this book in the description, both the EU and the US version, if you're interested. I really recommend you checking it out.
In Canada, the easiest way to get it is through Columbia University Press, which is the official distributor for Ibidam Verlag out of Stuttgart.
Mm-hmm. So let's see here. Let me bring up my notes. First of all, I guess, and someone already asked this in the chat, what is the Years of Great Silence?
It's an English translation of Die Jahre des großen Schweigens, which is what the survivors of the deportation, and they were placed under these restrictions called special settler, with the official classification. So in Russia, it's Spetsposelenci, is special settlers, and then special settlements, Spetsposeleni, special settlements. But they were invented in 1930 by the head of the man who will become head of Gulag in 32, Matvei Berman, as a way to deal with the mass number of uprooted kulaks that they just didn't want to spend the money on infrastructure for actual labor camps. So these were areas of internal exile under confinement. The areas had roadblocks and checkpoints between them, but obviously far fewer men than would need to run an actual corrective labor camp. And they also were used for forced labor, particularly early on in felling of trees in the far north and in the Urals during the early 30s. And then this was later applied to most of the deported nationalities. It doesn't apply to the Koreans, who have a different status. It's a little less onerous. They were administrative exiles, but it applied to all the other ones during the war. So the Germans, the Chechens, the Crimean Tatars, the Kalmucks were all special settlers. And so they're in this confined internal exile in Kazakhstan and Siberia. And then in the beginning of 42, in part because of Soviet need for labor, but also serious social problems, having dumped 800,000 now completely impoverished Germans who were fairly well off to do before that, amidst Russians in Siberia and Kazakhs in Kazakhstan. There was quite a bit of social pressure, conflict, particularly in Kazakhstan, where Kazakhs generally didn't speak Russian at that time, and many times being placed in the same houses, different religion. So in order to kind of reduce this, they again mobilize all of the adults that are able-bodied, starting with deported men in January of 42, and then there had men who had already been living in Siberia and Kazakhstan before the deportation. There were about 200,000 total population. So the men were about maybe 45,000 adults that were capable of labor. And then finally, in October 1942, they started mobilizing women. So this was drafted as a alternative to military service. They were conscripted by the People's Commissariat of Defense. They went down to the induction point. They had a medical exam, and then they were turned over to the People's Commissariat of Internal Affairs, the NKVD, and taken on trains to labor camps run by Gulag in mostly the Urals, mostly used in either industrial construction to build giant industrial complexes like Bakalstroy, which was for iron and steel, or Solikamsk, which was for cellulose and paper, or Bogoslav log, which was aluminum, or they were used in forestry to fell and move trees, which was a major export in the 30s and 40s for Soviet hard currency.
So I think to many people, or maybe my ignorance is showing, when you hear, ethnically German Russians or ethnic Germans living in Russia or Soviets, my first question is, I didn't know there were any. But for anyone who didn't know there were any, what is the sort of history of these people in the region around the Volga and Crimea, etc.? Can you give a short?
Okay. So the Russian Germans, Russlanddeutsche or Rossiyski Nemцы in Russian, and really Russlanddeutsche is the name used in Germany, where many of them now live because they've left Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan and emigrated. Really means Russia German, but that doesn't work in English, so you get the N. But it's a geographical term referring to the Russian Empire. So in 1763, on 22nd of July, there was a second manifesto to invite foreigners. The first one didn't get much traction by Catherine the Great. The first one was in December 1762. The one in 1763 is very detailed, and it provides a lot of benefits, including freedom from taxation, freedom from conscription, freedom of religion, self-government to any Christian foreigners, although the Christian part is only mentioned in the 1762 manifesto, who wished to migrate into the Russian Empire. And so this is right after the 7 Years' War, which has a lot of push factors for people in the various German states. And so a large number, about 25,000 Germans from places like Hesse and the Rhineland and even Alsace in France, migrate to the Volga River near Saratov and establish colonies. And so there is they have their own section of government to administer them. It's later abolished by Catherine the Great, but then her son, Paul I, revives it, and it exists until it's abolished by Alexander II in the 1870s. So they get a pretty good deal as far as they get the free land, they get no taxation, no conscription, and they are allowed to practice their forms of Christianity, which are mostly Lutheran, but there's already a large Catholic minority in the 1760s and 1770s migrating into the Volga region. The downside, which they're not told by the recruiters, the touts that the Russian Empire sends into the German-speaking states, is that they're in the borderlands between Asian nomads and Moscow. And it's also an area where there's also a lot of runaway serfs. So the violence from the uprising by Pugachev and Kazakh nomads attacking German villages and taking slaves to sell in the Emirate of Bukhara further southeast are a major problem early on, but they weren't informed about this. But eventually they managed to stabilize. And because this becomes the largest area for German colonists as far as population, most of the population growth being natural after the initial migration, although there's some later migration directly from Europe, Central Europe. And then later, her son, Paul I, gives a charter of privileges to Mennonites from West Prussia, and they settle in the Black Sea region. The Crimean Khanate had been defeated and annexed by Catherine II, his mother. And so these areas along the Black Sea coast in the Crimea and southern Ukraine are opened up to settlement. And in 1804, the grandson of Catherine the Great, Alexander I, has a new manifesto inviting European settlers. And again, most people taking this up are people from the German-speaking states. This is before German unification in 1871. And then you have the second large group of Germans in the Russian Empire in the Black Sea region, mostly in what is now Ukraine.
Right. So when we sort of get to the time period between World War I and World War II, the Germans have been living in that area for quite some time. But you write in your book that they were also quite severely impacted by the rise of the Soviet Union, the internal struggles and sort of the changes that happened in the USSR. Am I remembering that correctly?
Well, I mean, they, like any other national group, they tried to best represent, or at least the intellectual leadership, the interest as they could. And so in some cases, they did okay, depending on the time. But as time went on, it became much more difficult. So, and then there's a period of time where it eases off a little bit, but they never get their full rights restored. So initially, after the revolution, they're in an ambivalent position because the Tsarist government had already deported some 200,000 ethnic Germans from Western Ukraine and Russian Poland and Bessarabia eastward into the Volga and Siberia, and there were plans to deport the Volga Germans into Siberia. But the Tsarist government is overthrown and the provisional government established in February 1917. And when the Germans military occupies Ukraine, they give special privileges and protection to the Germans living there. And the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk gives some limited treaty protection to the Volga Germans, including right to migrate to Germany proper and take their property with them. So this is between March and November in 1918, with the Bolsheviks in power. But the Germans occupying most of Ukraine limit the power of the Bolsheviks. But then there is the Civil War breaks out. And mostly because they're wealthier, they're subject to being pillaged, forced requisitions, all kinds of violence in the process, including rape and obviously killings, not just by the Bolsheviks, although in the Volga region, they're the largest perpetrators, but also in eastern Ukraine with the large Mennonite population, the anarchists under Nestor Makhna target them for these types of crimes. So they're not doing too well in that, and it's leads to a famine where many of them die in 21 and 22. But one of the interesting things is the Bolsheviks, particularly Lenin, wanted to use the nationalities in the Soviet Union that had ties, the diasporas, with European powers as kind of a model for establishing a revolution. You know, look, your people are doing so well in under our socialist rule. You should emulate them. So the very first autonomous territory was actually the Volga German Workers' Commune, which was established under the signature of Lenin in October of 1918. And that becomes the Volga German Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic in 1924.
So they became sort of the forerunners for all of the other, like the shining example in a sense.
Yeah, so the Volga German Workers' Commune was the first, even though they were a diaspora group, they could trace their immigration not too far back to 1764 with the first German colony on the Volga. The first indigenous people to get an autonomous territory were the Bashkirs, and I believe that was in 1919. So the next year after the Germans had already gotten an autonomous territory.
Right. And so these Germans then live, obviously, in this area until the start of World War II. I believe in your book you write from 1941 and onwards. The Soviets then decide that now we're going to start the labor activities, the deportations, the recruitment, whatever you want to call it, the conscription. And so you say that this was specifically targeted as well against Germans. Like this went by blood. If you had parents who were Russian, I believe you were spared. Is that correct?
Yes. So they were targeted because the Soviets had an idea of kind of primordial ethno-nationhood. Nationalnost is the term in Russian. And it has a strong racial and biological component to it, is that because the majority of German history was outside the Russian Empire, obviously, people ethnically, culturally tied to Germany, even though they came before Germany existed as a modern state in 1871, they would also be politically loyal to it. So when Germany invaded the Soviet Union on 22nd of June, 1941, they decided they weren't going to take any chances and started rounding up all of the people that were classified as German, these people generally spoke German as their first language, and they said were coming from backgrounds that were Lutheran or Catholic or Mennonite rather than Russian Orthodox. Loaded them onto cattle cars and deported them to northern Kazakhstan, Siberia, where they're dropped off in the middle of nowhere on remote Kazakh ols or Siberian kolkhozes. And then there's earlier mobilization in the labor army in August 1941, particularly out of eastern Ukraine, but it's only about 20,000 people. The decree on 10th of January 1942 aims to get 120,000 people, but they fall short of it. And that's why they have the second decree in 14th of February 1942 for men that were not deported. And that brings it over 120,000 ethnic German men who are considered to be able-bodied, who are sent mostly, it's said, to the Urals. Krasnodar is in Siberia, the lumber camp. In Karaganda, in Kazakhstan, is a coal mining camp there. But for the most part, they are sent to either do felling of trees in places like Vyatlog and Gorky or Usolog, or sent to do this industrial construction in places like Bakalstroy or Bogoslav.
Right, and at this point, is it only men who are sent?
Yeah,
I
women
believe
are not conscripted into the labor army until October. So 7th of October 1942, the decree goes out that so originally it was men 17 to 50. And in October, they made it men
Right.
15 to 55, and then women, I believe it was 16 to 45. But there were other peoples, the Germans were like 75, 80% of the labor army that were conscripted into it. But the Germans are the only nationality where women were conscripted. In no other case do you have this forced labor without any charges or trials or even sentences. You didn't know how long you were going to be there. Originally, the Soviet government said for the length of the war, but most of them were not released until 1948, and some were not released until 1957.
Wow, 1957. That's quite a long time.
My brother used to say, our people were slaves
Stalin,
until
isn't it?
1957. Where are reparations?
Yeah, right. Exactly, yeah. So why do you think they started? I mean, you said the Germans were the only ones who would deport women. Why do you think the women were included
Well,
in the Germans
one,
specifically?
they're the largest deported group. As I said, almost half of the deportees and special settlers are ethnic Germans. So they ended up being 1.2 million or so German special settlers. The next largest group, the Kazakhs, is only 400,000, a third. Two,
Oh, well, yeah.
they were much harder workers than many of these people, the Chechens and Kalmucks. These other people did not have the type of work ethic for a modern economy that the Germans did. The only deported people that, other than the Germans, that had this were the Koreans earlier. And there were quite a few Koreans in the labor army, something like 15,000, and the Crimean Tatars. And there were quite a few Crimean Tatars in the labor army too, mostly mining coal in Moscow and Tula, about 5,000. But the other nationalities they had not managed to inculcate modern industrial discipline into. So they were much harder to use as a workforce in these types of situations. And there's so many more German. And also, while it's never stated, but the Germans are connected with their main enemy. So I think there's a motivation to punish them more than other ethnic groups.
That does make sense in a way. I do remember that there is you had a quote from some Soviet I'm not sure if it was some director or officer talking about how hardy and hardworking the Germans were, how they took to sort of the tough terrain and the conditions much better
That
than
was
anyone else.
actually the late Vien Zemskov, who was the
Right.
first Russian scholar who was not a member of the Communist Party who was allowed access to archives on the Gulag and other forms of national repression, particularly the national deportation. In 2005, he wrote a very good book on the deportations starting in 1930 with the kulaks and going all the way through to 1960, when the last of the special settlers from the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, are released. But he is no longer with us. But he has a quotation in his book where he says the reason the Germans survived so well, I mean, something like 20% died, but it would have been much higher, like the Chechens, if was because they were able to adapt in the harshest of conditions in Siberia and Kazakhstan. And Solzhenitsyn made this observation earlier, particularly again with Kazakhstan, about the German being like a willow tree. You can wherever you plant him, he will do well.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a I guess it's a good moniker coming from your oppressor in a sense.
I don't think Zemskov was an
So,
oppressor, but yeah, obviously he's drawing on to some extent Russian stereotypes that go back to Dostoevsky and others of the German colonists in the Russian Empire.
right. So we touched a bit on it, but when these Germans then get deported in 1941, 1942, they go to Kazakhstan, and sort of what is it? Just sort of labor camp activities? What sort of is their life there?
So they are the special settle. Initially, the special settlements are settlements in the 30s under during the deportation of the kulaks. They sent to areas and told to build their own villages. By 1941, when the Germans are deported, this has changed. So there isn't such a thing as spetspaseleni, special settlements anymore. There are just spetspaselenci, special settlers, because they are settled in existing collective farms where there's already people living in the buildings in other rooms. In the case of Kazakhstan, mostly ethnic Kazakhs. In the case of Siberia, mostly ethnic Russians. So they are forced to share these same houses with people already there. But they are not given the same rights as other Soviet citizens. So they can't leave their village that they are sent to without special permission from the NKVD and later MVD, Ministry of Internal Affairs. Have to get special permission from the special commandant of the NKVD. They get like a little visa in their internal passport with itineraries. It's usually good for 3 days. So, but other than that, they're limited to a radius of radius of 3 kilometers from the village. They can't leave. So oftentimes this meant they couldn't even go to the bazaar without getting one of these travel documents from the local NKVD special commandant. And they're required to have a monthly interview with the special commandant, usually a kind of political interrogation. And if they violated anything, they could be without trial fined up to 100 rubles or just thrown in jail for 5 days. But that's what on the official paper. I've talked to some people in Kyrgyzstan. They said, no, it was usually 10 days, not 5. Right. They just forgot about us. So it was pretty harsh. One of my articles, I compare it in some ways to the apartheid laws in South Africa during the 1950s and 60s.
Right, something similar to that, yeah. So you have a chapter in the book called "Fishing in Siberia," because a lot of these Germans seems to have been moved around multiple times.
Yes.
And some of them end up in Siberia doing, working as fishermen. Is that Is that it?
Yeah, well, so about half of the Germans deported from the European areas of the USSR. So the big region, the Volga, and then there's they only get the eastern Ukraine, about 100,000. The other 300,000 are temporarily saved by the Wehrmacht. There's about 40,000 in Georgia and Azerbaijan and the Transcaucasus, communities in Moscow and the North Caucasus and other areas. But so they're deported mostly into the southern areas of Siberia, in Krasnoyarsk Krai in the east, and then Omsk Oblast, Novosibirsk Oblast, and Altai Krai in the west. And the Germans advancing and taking most of Ukraine fairly rapidly leave a serious protein deficiency for the Soviet Red Army because they don't have the livestock anymore. And then when you add Belarus and Western Russia all the way up to the gates of Moscow, right, they've lost huge amount of the cattle. So they try and find other ways to make up for it. The one way they try and raise more cattle in Kazakhstan, which is something the Soviets will continue throughout their existence, all the way through to Brezhnev. Another thing they do is they try and open up the Arctic rivers and the Arctic Sea Basin in the very northern part of the Soviet Union to fishing. And this is where a large number of ethnic Germans from southern Siberia that had just been deported are all of a sudden in January 1942 moved again to work in these frozen rivers and also Lake Baikal and, of course, the very northern Arctic Sea to get fish for the Red Army. So they're not all Germans up there. There's some other deported people. Later, quite a few Kalmucks were sent in 1943. And when the Germans are sent, they also send some Greeks and Finns who have been deported as well. But again, most of the people in the fishing industry are German special settlers that are sent there to try and get open up these basically frozen rivers and the Arctic Ocean to get protein for the Red Army. And ultimately, while it helps a little bit, the problem is solved by Lend-Lease, the United States shipping Hormel's shoulder of pork and ham, or better known as Spam, in large amount to feed the Red Army.
Yes. Yes, it was Spam that saved the West. That's very good.
I knew a guy in the Merchant Marine who job was to deliver Spam to Murmansk in the Soviet far north during the Second World War.
Interesting. Yeah, that must be kind of strange at a point in history where you're not quite sure whether or not the Soviets are your friends, but you have to deliver Spam to them because that's what you've been told to do, right? Okay, so you mentioned some numbers earlier when it comes to how many people were deported. In total, do we have any accurate numbers at all on how many people were forcibly deported, and especially how many people were?
A whole bunch.
I believe the word is excess premature deaths, right?
Initially, it's about 800,000, and this is from starting on 3rd September of 1941 up until 1st of January 1941. And then later added are a little over 200,000 ethnic Germans from central and western Ukraine who are forcibly repatriated back in 1945 and 1946. Many of them forcibly sent back by the U.S. and British militaries in Germany. So that's another 200,000. That's 1 million. There's about 200,000, I said, Germans that were living in the East already. About half of them are given special settlement status. For some reason, there's about 100,000 in various parts of Siberia, almost none in Central Asia or Kazakhstan. that avoided. So in 1953, there's 1.2 million Germans that are special settlers in the Soviet Union, but there's also about 100,000 Germans in Siberia that are not special settlers. So the total population was about 1.3 million.
That are just unaccounted for. Yeah.
No, they're not unaccounted. They were not deported, so they didn't become special settlers that way. And the special settlement restrictions on Germans that were already living in the East were imposed after the defeat of Germany. So the 9th of May, 1945 is the day the Soviets celebrated Victory Day. It's 8th of May in the U.S. and U.K. because of the time difference. But starting on 18th of September 1945, the local MVD started putting the Germans in Kazakhstan that were there before 41 under special settlement restrictions. And they then extended this into Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. But for some reason, areas like Altai Krai, in particular, in Western Siberia, they didn't do this. So almost all the 100,000 that were not put under special settlement restrictions are either in Siberia or the Urals. They're not in Central Asia. And this continues up until November 1946, at which time almost all of the Germans in Kazakhstan, I think there's 200 that are not special settlers out of 400,000 at this time. That
must be very strange to have lived through the war.
A much smaller population. This is after the war is over, yes. This starts in September. Yeah. The war ends in May.
Exactly. It must be very strange to have lived through the war without that special settler status and then have it imposed on you after the war when things have
right. But a lot of them were already being conscripted into the labor army after 14th of February 1942. So you get this weird thing where you have Germans that were special settlers, and then their special settlement status is removed because they become conscripts in the labor army, and the status is officially mobilized Germans. Right. And then you have people that were free citizens that were never special settlers who are mobilized the next month, who are given the status of mobilized Germans. And then if they survive and are released, most of them again after the war in 48, they get the status of special settler. For the first time, not in 41, but in 48, because they had not been special settlers when they were mobilized into the labor army, which is in Russian, Trudovaya Armia, or generally contracted to Trud Armia, which didn't have an official status until the very end of the Soviet Union, maybe even might have been after the collapse of the USSR. So in all the Soviet era documents, it just refers to mobilized Germans.
Okay, so it wasn't really recognized. I see. I mean, that must be some of the difficulty with working with these sort of declassified Soviet documents, is half the time you can't really trust them, maybe.
Well, the categories make these things like getting numbers difficult, right? So for a long time, people were claiming that the total number of Germans in the Soviet Union in 1953 was 1.2 million because that's what comes up on the special settlement records. But if you look more in the archives, you find there's 100,000 Germans in places like Altai Krai that were never special settlers. So the total population is actually 1.3 million, which makes it easier to understand how they got to 1.6 million in 1956.
Yeah. Those numbers match up better. So the other half of my question there were what you've referred to, and others I guess have referred to as excess premature deaths as a result of this deportation. Is there any numbers here?
Yeah, well, I go through it all. My estimate is at least 200,000 for the entire period of 41 and 48 due to the deportation, poor material conditions in the areas of special settlement, and of course, poor material conditions and inhumane labor in the labor army. I would say it's probably close to 250,000. The number I give, I think it's closest to 245,000, but the numbers on deaths are not well recorded. This was actually something early on in 42, the leadership of the NKVD was complaining about. It seemed a lot of the camp the people administrating the individual camps and the mobilized Germans in them just didn't care enough to even record the deaths.
Right. So there could be a lot of deaths that we just don't know about.
Right. So generally what you get, if you add up all the numbers, which you have for the individual camps, it's about 30,000 out of the 316,000 mobilized Germans recorded as having died in the camps. But from the 1930s, there's a deliberate Soviet policy, and it is doubled and tripled down regarding the labor army. If the person's going to die soon, release them so that we don't have to worry about the paperwork and burying the body and all that, right? Let them die walking home. So most scholars, people like A. German, who in the Volga region, or Kurochkin, who is a Russian a collaborator of his, or Kirillov, who's a Russian scholar of the Germans in the Ural, say that the number should be doubled, 60 to 70,000 deaths caused by the labor army. That is, about half of them died after being released within the first year from damage to their health done while they were working.
Yeah, and those numbers add up quite quickly to become something quite gruesome, really. So before we take some questions and comments from the chat, I have a couple of more in the timeline here, because we get to post-World War II, I guess post-Stalin era. You mentioned that the joke about, being slaves until 1958. I mean, has there been any sort of how did the ethnic Germans recover from this, and have there been any sort of, reparations, I suppose?
Okay, well, this is a long and complicated question. So initially,
we could split it up if you want. Yeah.
Yeah. Initially, they are released from special settlement restriction, but not allowed to return to where they were deported from or get any type of compensation for lost property. A huge amount of collective and personal property is, of course, confiscated by the Soviet government during the deportation. All right, so that is at the end of 1955, 13th December 1955. The special settlement restrictions are removed, but they can't go west of the Urals, really. They're not allowed to return to the Volga region or the Black Sea region. Then there is a movement. It starts very tenuously. Just a couple writers at first to try and get the restoration of the Volga German ASSR and be allowed to return home. And this takes up speed because the German government under Adenauer, West Germany, makes improvement of the conditions of the ethnic German, the Soviet Union, one of the negotiating points with the Soviet government for recognition and a normalization of trade. In 1964, the Soviet government issues a decree which doesn't allow them to return home. It says that they become rooted in their place of settlement. But it does say that the allegations and accusations of treason were completely baseless, that the Germans in the Soviet Union were patriotic Soviet citizens and through their work contributed to the quote-unquote victory over fascism. So that spurred, for about 3 years, a stronger movement, including a woman named Maria Volga, who was not deported because her husband was a Jew from Germany who came over to be a translator. So if the father was not an ethnic German, the whole family could avoid deportation. But there was only like 1,000 out of 450,000 Volga Germans applied to.
Was a bit of a loophole.
The interesting thing is she became editor of the German language newspaper in Moscow. And her son, one of the most famous modern Soviet composers. So we have this kind of strange things of history. What would happen if they had been deported? They might have well died.
Right.
So
sure. Yeah.
The movement, it kind of fizzles out in 1967. Mikoyan is the point man for all the deported peoples. He meets with the Crimean Tatars and the Meskhetian Turks as well. And he's rumored, we don't have solid evidence, be the only member of the Politburo who abstained rather than voted yes on these deportations. And the reason is being, they think, because he's Armenian, he was well aware what these deportations meant, because the Ottomans had deported the Armenians into
You could see the writing on
deserts
the
of
wall.
Syria
Yeah.
and Iraq, and 40% of them died.
Yeah.
But McCoyan was fairly honest. He said that we can't restore the homeland because we need you as the only disciplined workforce in northern Kazakhstan. The entire economy would collapse if we give you the right to return back to your homeland. So after
You're too
that,
good to let go.
after that, there's a they're kind of puzzled about what to do next. But then they see that the Jews are agitating to leave the Soviet Union and go to Israel, just abandon the whole project and go to their ancestral or ethnic, however you want to define it, homeland outside the USSR.
Sure. Yeah.
And so the Germans start copying that and demanding the right to emigrate to West Germany. And that movement had a little bit more success. About a little over 60,000 Germans are allowed to migrate to West Germany during the 1970s.
So, so there's been no sort of official. There was never any sort of official statement of apology.
Yeah, there was at the end of the
I
Soviet
mentioned
Union.
the word reparations.
There's one by Yeltsin in 1989. No, there's one by the Soviet government in 1989 before they collapsed, and there's one by the Russian Federation under Yeltsin in 1991. And there is later a small token payment for the few survivors of the labor army. I think they were given a flat sum of 2,000 euros for the 8 years they spent as forced laborers.
All right. So there were some recognition, at least.
Yes, but not a
else.
lot, and it's quite delayed. So
No.
there's,
Yes.
I mean, officially until 1972, when there's a third rehabilitation decree, they can't live, in the western areas of the USSR. They don't have the right to choose their residency at the same collective level as their nationalnosti. In 72, this is collectively given primarily because the Soviet Union is working on the convention with Guinea in the UN on the crime of apartheid, and it wouldn't look very good for them to have apartheid on their books while attacking South Africa for it. So they officially repeal that collectively, but the loophole is individually it still has to be approved by officials in the Soviet government, and a lot of times the Soviets would just arbitrarily deny the right to live west of the Ural. But a number did get permission to move to Estonia and Latvia, which had been annexed by the Soviets for the second time at the end of the Second World War. And they also had a better chance of getting a right to emigrate to Germany out of Estonia and Latvia than they did from places like Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan.
Yeah. So, I mean, we mentioned this a little bit. My final, I guess, discussion point here. You mentioned this a little bit at the start. Why do you think that sort of this part of World War II history has received so little attention in the West after the war? I mean, of course, there's the declassification, which has sort of delayed the effect of it, but you think this would have been a bigger deal, right?
I think, particularly for the United States, obviously it's different in Germany for a number of reasons that are obvious. But in the U.S., there wasn't any real interest in a small persecuted minority that was accused of being collaborators, even though they didn't have any chance to collaborate really, except in some very in the very western part of the Soviet Union, places like Transnistria in the far west of Ukraine. Even though they really were a persecuted minority, the fact that this had been an issue for the National Socialist government, both during the war and before the war, they had taken this issue from the Weimar Republic. President Hindenburg had been a contributor of aid and assistance to Germans starving to death in Ukraine during the Holodomor. The idea you don't want to associate with these people because they were a cause for the National Socialists. And in the United States, there's a large number of people of German from Russia descent, particularly the Volga Germans and Black Sea Germans in the Midwest. Nebraska and Kansas, Colorado have large Volga German population. The Dakotas have large Black Sea German population. But this idea that you wanted to become super American patriots, so you weren't going to talk about anything controversial from the motherland, as it were. And this really becomes kind of a post-war silence, as it well. It's only in the 1990s, after the archives come out in the former Soviet Union itself, that you see a sea shift among Americans descended of Russian Germans, where they embrace the issue as a horrible crime against humanity, against people that they were literally related to by blood, and often cases as close as first cousins.
Yeah. All right. I think that sort of wraps up the main outline of your work here. I have a couple of comments from the chat. I think I'll just bring them up. Some of them are questions you might be able to answer. If not, we'll just move through them. If anyone who is listening would like to ask Jonathan anything, you can put that in the chat and I'll bring it up on the screen. So first of all, we have a comment from Cyber Chud Internal Affairs, who says, I still haven't finished the book, but it's tragic in the context of the goodwill extended by Catherine the Great being reneged. Yeah,
the privileges were revoked by Alexander II, who wanted to do a couple of things. One, he abolished serfdom because they wanted to basically have a creation of a Rechtsstaat based on laws where everybody, at least in the bottom of society, kind of had the same legal status, that to simplify the social order. The other thing is, in 1871, Germany is unified by Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, and they are now viewed as a Trojan horse. So they lose all of their privileges, including the freedom from consent. Of course, Catherine II had been long dead by this time, so there wasn't anybody in the crown or court advocating for the German colonists.
Sure. Yeah, it makes sense. Douge asks, was there any internal impulse within Germany to cause the initial migrations, I assume, to Russia?
Yes. The 7-Year War, with large amounts of destruction, conscription, high taxes, repression of various religious groups. So there's a big push factor as a result of the war being fought between Prussia and France, with the British supporting Prussia. In the United States, we call this the French-Indian War, but the biggest part of it, as far as killing, was actually in Europe, not in North America. But in many ways, it's kind of the First World War, because there's also combat in the Indian Ocean and some other places. But since a lot of it was in the German-speaking states between Prussia and France, they were kind of tired of being conscripted and being taxed and having foreign soldiers run over their farms. So when the Russian government under Catherine II, who herself was a German who went there and converted from Lutheranism to the Orthodox Church, marrying Peter III, who she then helped kill to take power, they thought it was a pretty good deal. And on paper, it looked really good, because they didn't talk about, this Kazakh and Bashkir and Kalmyk nomads might raid you and take you off to slavery in Bukhara. But on the paper, it looked very good.
Sure. I can understand the them wanting to do it that way. Let's see here. Bill Wilson is asking me a question. Is Ludwig stuck in a Siberian coal mine? Ludwig Path is the co-host of the show. No, he's just on vacation. He's gonna be back in a couple of weeks. It's a well-deserved vacation. Good Night asks, I'm not sure if you were able to comment on this, but he asked, what role did Russian Muslims play?
In what?
I'm not quite sure. That's what he said.
I mean,
so maybe Good Night can follow up, and we can comment on that later.
A lot of the neighbors of the Germans, especially starting after they start spreading eastward because they no land left for them in the Volga and the Black Sea region, into what is now the first settlements in Central Asia by Germans are in Kyrgyzstan by Mennonites, but later you get a lot of Lutheran settlements, particularly in Kazakhstan. So their neighbors would have been Muslim. And of course, after the deportation, there's a lot of their neighbors are Muslim. They don't get along with the Kazakhs initially in 1941, for the most part. The Soviet archives have a number of reports about hostilities. But one can't really fault, if you think about it, the Kazakhs, they don't speak any of the languages that these new people coming in, right? And all of a sudden one day, the Soviet government starts putting all these people in your house in different rooms of it that you share nothing with. It's probably not going to be Kumbaya welcome fest.
Yeah, probably not. It makes sense. On top of that, he works harder than you too, apparently. So...
That's true. That's true. The Kazakhs were semi-nomadic people historically, not people who were into sedentary agriculture or industry.
Yeah. Another one from Goodnight. I'm not sure quite what he's getting at here, but he says, was there any hostilities about the Protestant Orthodox thing after and during the Soviet era? Can it be taken as a representative of the relations between the two?
I don't think there really any. Of course, the Protestant churches, the Lutheran, the largest, but also Mennonites in particular, because of their pacifism and refusal to swear oath, were particularly repressed by the Soviet government. The Baptists got a little bit of relief during the Second World War when they signed a concordant with the Soviet government to support the war effort against Berlin. But the Russian Orthodox Church, because it was so large and so established and so central, always had an official subordinated status under the Soviet government, continuing in many ways from what it had under the Tsarist government. So Peter the Great, of course, had abolished the patriarchy in order to subordinate the Russian Orthodox Church closer to the Russian state. And in the Soviet period, even though they bring back the patriarchy, they keep it under tight control, which I suppose is better than being totally outlawed like some of the Protestant sects. But the Russian Orthodox Church itself, I don't see any conflict here. As a general rule, the Germans got along better with the Russians because they were fellow Europeans, and many of the Germans at this point, especially men, could speak Russian because they had learned it either in school or more usually, like my great-grandfather learned it in the Tsarist era, by serving in the military.
Right. Okay, so that's all the comments we had lined up here. There's still some time if anyone has any more things they would like to ask. I'm going to once again remind everyone that the book we are discussing is available. It's called The Years of Great Silence. Links to purchase them are in the description below, or you can go to probably your Twitter profile, right? Where can people find you if they want to read more of your stuff?
It's pinned at the top of my Twitter profile, the website for Columbia University Press. They have a little section on it, but that's the official distributor for North America. If you're in the European Union, then easiest way is to go to Ibidem Verlag, the publisher itself. They have website in both German and English. They are out of Stuttgart and Hanover. If you are in a country that is neither U.S., Canada, or a member of the European Union, it becomes more difficult.
But you should still be
Amazon is
able
one place
to,
you can get it from, though.
yeah, you can still find it in ebook formats outside of the EU, I believe. I had some problems getting it shipped, but if you want to have like the PDF format or whatever the equivalent is, it's possible.
Norway just needs to join the EU, and then the shipping prices will go down.
Yes, but I believe our fishing industries will suffer, so I think that's what's holding us back.
I know that, but it's an anomaly that there's some countries in Europe that aren't EU members. So you would think the distance.
We got the worst of both worlds option.
The shipping costs go up huge when it's outside the EU.
Yeah, it does. But we got the EEC membership, which is the worst of both worlds options. We have to sort of follow a lot of the EU directives. We don't have any say, so. And we don't get the cheap shipping, so yeah. I'm not sure if it's been great for us, but it's working so far, and I do believe, I don't know, it might be on the table in the coming years. I would be more inclined for a EU membership if it intended to politically position itself as something apart from the US. I know Macron has been banging the war drums about establishing an EU army, so we'll see.
All right.
Okay, so
thank you for having me on.
Great having you on. Before we log off, you didn't mention it briefly, but if you want to tell people where they can find you, follow you, I know you have a Substack probably as well. I've linked that down in the description below. Anything else?
I have an academia edu page where I have a lot of my shorter academic pieces up, including a piece from 2016 in the Russian Review called "The Persecution of Ethnic Germans in the USSR During World War II," which is kind of the initial embryo and kernel of this book. So you want to see kind of how it, the very, very shortest part of the argument, you could go there for free.
And I would recommend the book in all seriousness to anyone who's interested. It's well cited. It's got a good length. It's not too long. It's well written. It's informative. It has some cool tables in it and all that stuff. It's a very nice read, very enlightening, and very, very good. So it'll run you about, I believe, if you're in the EU, it'll run you about 35 euros. In the US, it's about 40, I think. So it's not that steep of a price.
42 US dollars.
Yes. Douche says that you did an interview with Pete Quinones. So if people are interested in more of you, they I guess they can find an interview with you there as well.
Yes.
Okay. Well, I think that's everything we had for this week. I thank you all for watching or listening, and we'll be back next week. And until then, I wish you a good night and a great weekend. I'm going to play our intro here real quick. Sorry, outro, and we'll get this offline.
No.